Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabester here. This is the tank guide for Normal and Heroic Beastlord Darmac. And tanking this encounter has a few complications actually. It's not just a straightforward tank and spank type thing. There are quite a few things going on. So mostly it's going to be about focusing on your positioning, picking up a lot of adds very frequently, managing tank swaps based on the particular debuff that's going out at the time, and positioning the boss when necessary based on his health so that he will mount the proper beast. So let's get started. So the first important thing to understand is how the phasing occurs in this fight. So when Darmac reaches various health levels, he will leap to and mount the nearest of the three prime beasts that start out in the cubbies around this room. So you can see the health levels there, 85, then 65, and finally 45%. And because it's the nearest prime beast to his location at the time, it's up to you as a tank to make sure that the boss is positioned near whichever prime beast you want to activate next. Usually the basic order is going to be Cruelfang, then Ironcrusher, and finally Dreadwing. You can arguably do Ironcrusher first and then Cruelfang second, but the important thing is simply to make sure Dreadwing is last. So for simplicity's sake, because of where you're positioning for the lesser adds, usually you want to do Cruelfang first. Now before we get into the specifics of the Prime Beast abilities, Darmac has two main abilities that he'll use. One is a Spear Throw, which doesn't affect tanks at all, but the other is Call the Pack, which is primarily a tank mechanic. This will call a series of 6 lesser beasts from the empty cubby in this room, so the one marked in blue for our raid markers there. And these 6 beasts will just charge out. They have normal threat, very low health, they're not all that dangerous, but as a tank, of course, it's important that you or your tank partner pick these up immediately and tank them in cleave range or melee position so that your raid can AE them down quickly. They're not all that dangerous, but you need to make sure you kill them off fairly quickly. So once Cruelfang activates and he's mounted, the boss will gain his abilities throughout the remainder of the fight. And the main ability to worry about as a tank is Rend and Tear. This will target a random ranged player and leap toward them, doing a Rend and Tear attack at their location, and then he will leap back to the current tank at the time and do another Rend and Tear at that location. Now the basic idea here is that you want to try to move away when the boss leaps away the first time. And that way, when he leaps back to you, he will hopefully not be within 7-yard radius of other players in the raid, particularly your melee. The Rend and Tear itself will apply a stacking dot. So this is a minor concern for tanks, although usually mechanics later in the fight will dictate your tank swaps. But do your best to simply step back a few yards when the boss is leaping away so that hopefully he will come back to you away from the rest of the melee. But it's also up to your melee DPS to move as well. Now next, when Ironcrusher activates, the boss will gain a number of new abilities. Stampede will knock back melee and rush to a random range member, but you can't really avoid it, so don't really worry about it. But the main one for tanks is Crush Armor. And this is the first real major tank swap mechanic, essentially. So you'll want to swap based on the stack count of this, usually at 2 or 3 stacks, because it reduces armor by 10% per stack. So other than that, you'll need to handle all the basic mechanics that you have been with your tank partner, but just watch these stack counts and swap accordingly. So finally, when Dreadwing is active, you get a new sort of tank swap mechanic, which is Searing Fangs, and this will cause attacks from the boss to deal fire damage. However, the Searing Fangs applies a stacking debuff called Seared Flesh, and that's the actual tank swap debuff that you need to watch out for. So the basic idea here is that it can stack up pretty high. It's not kind of on a cooldown so much as just how often you avoid it. So this best thing to do is just make sure that when you are not tanking the boss, once your Seared Flesh drops, you taunt immediately, and your tanking partner has to do the same, and that's that. But that's the primary tank swap mechanic. So if you get really high stacks and you can't swap, make sure you use some form of cooldown for that. Another thing to watch for as a tank even is the breath the Dreadwing will use. This just faces a random direction and does 3 pulses of fire breath, stacking a fire dot as well as doing damage over time every time it ticks. So the best thing you can do is just sidestep quickly if he's facing toward you. The cone or angle of this breath is pretty large, and because you're going to have stacks of seared flesh increasing the fire damage you take, this can be quite dangerous if you don't watch for it. The last mechanic to think about as a tank for the final phase is engulfing of the lesser beast corpses. So essentially what can happen is when the lesser beasts die, their corpses will be set on fire, and of course will burn anyone, you or other melee DPS that are standing on top of them. So probably the best thing you can do to handle this is once you have the lesser beasts that have freshly spawned active and you've killed them off, just move the tank a few yards along one wall or the other, just so you can get out of the radius of those little fire patches from their corpses. And you can just repeat this process over and over. Since tank swaps will dictate which tank is holding the boss at the time, the other tank can be in charge of picking up the beasts if you happen to be far away from their spawn point. But that will just depend on your raid's DPS and all that. But the main thing is just to make sure that you or other melee don't have to stand in unnecessary fire during this phase. So that should cover it, I think. It sounds like a lot of different mechanics to watch, but mostly it's just knowing which mechanic to watch for tank swaps based on the phase that you're in. And other than that, the final phase is really the only one where there are a lot of things going on for tanks to watch for. But mostly it's about positioning the boss properly, manage your tank swaps, and you should be fine from there. So that is the tank guide for Beastlord Darmac. As always, good luck, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. He'll be riding a giant elephant when he comes. He'll be riding a giant elephant when he... Oh, it's an elk? Shit.